Okay, so we are going to do a sleeveless armhole using bias binding tape to finish off our sleeveless edge really nicely. There's lots of different ways to do a sleeveless armhole. You can do a lining that drops into the fabric. Basically, you just have to come up with some way to finish off this raw edge. So again, if you sewed a lining in, it would just sew here and it would drop towards the inside, and then all of this would get turned under as you sewed, and that would be nice and neat. You could also do a facing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and we'll do a facing that goes on our collar to finish that off. But I'm just going to show you this technique so that you've got lots of options using bias binding tape, and this is the way I do it. Again, there's lots of different ways to do bias binding to finish off an edge, but this is the way I'd like you to do it because this is the way that I prefer from my own best practices, the way that I like to get it done. So again, bias binding looks like this. Remember, the one that I had you buy is a double fold, so it opens up and it's folded, in half and then folded in on itself again. So it's got this really nice edge to it. And then what you're going to do is get enough of your bias binding to go around your armhole. So what I like to do is usually start at this bottom seam and I let it overlap by like a 1/2 inch, and then I just sort of walk it around to determine if this is enough. And when I get all the way back down to, to this bottom seam again, I overlap again, and then I know I've got plenty, and then you can cut it. Okay, so I've already got mine cut, ready to go. So let's set it up and sew it on. So remember, with our double fold bias binding, one side is always folded in a little smaller than the other, right? See how I can see the other side here, and on this side I can't. So this is the smaller side. So let's take this smaller side, and that's what we're going to match up to the edge of our armhole. And again, I'm going to start down here in the armpit. If I'm going to have anything like 2 layers or an ugly knot or some kind of end seam, I'd rather it be at the armpit than somewhere else on my sleeve that you can really see. So I'm going to just again overlap this seam by about a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to start pinning this to the edge. So we want this to line right up to the edge of the fabric, okay? So again, this is a time when you're going to use a lot of pins because you really want this to line up really nice and evenly, and your entire armhole is curved, right? Because it's a round thing. The great thing about the bias tape, and that's why we use it, is it has a little bit of stretch built into it, and that makes it perfect for going around this rounded edge. It gives us stability because it's still woven, it's still firm, it doesn't stretch too much, but it stretches just enough to be able to let us make this curve all the way around and give just that little bit of stretch. And see here, I've come to the middle, but see how I'm just following the edge exactly. These two are lining up exactly. And I'll wrap all the way around, being careful not to pull either the fabric or the bias binding too much. I'm just kind of letting them line up as evenly as they like. I don't want to pull them and sort of like outstretch the shape that's naturally happening there. I just want to let it do what it wants to do. And I'm coming around, and really be careful on something like where you've got a notch that it doesn't pull. You want to pretend in that instance that that notch is still together. In super delicate fabrics where that might be an issue, you might not want to actually cut notches at all. Maybe you would just like draw them with tailor's chalk or something like that. And again, I'm gonna follow. I'm not just gonna pull this up, I'm gonna gently follow this curve all the way around. Okay, and then I'll stick one more pin here. There we go. And I'll kind of pin over top of both because I'll be basically sewing them both together, okay? So I've pinned this all the way around, and now what I would want to do is sew this. And just like the armhole and sleeve that we did last time, this would be hard to sew with all these pins, these long pins sticking out at me, and it's a really tiny hole that I'm trying to come over here and take from the machine. So what I suggest doing again is to hand baste this, and then we can pull out the pins and get rid of them. It's going to be so much easier to sew. Okay, so I've got my bias binding hand basted all the way around into my armhole. It's about a 1/2 inch stitch length, and it's sewn in this folded area, so pretty close to the edge, like 1/8 of an inch or a 1/4 inch from the edge. And now I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch from this edge, so it'll be a little bit over this folded line. Okay, just make sure that you're not sewing into this fold. If you need to, you can even like open this up right now to get it out of the way, because we're going to use that to fold it all in just a little bit. That might help. So I just want to sew a 1/2 inch from the edge, and again, that might be round about where that's ending anyway. And I'm going to start in the armpit seam here where I've got all this excess bias binding. I'll start somewhere around there, and then we'll just go nice and slow, making sure we're not sewing through any layers that we don't mean to. And trying to sew about a 1/2 inch from the edge. So I've got my needle started. I feel like this is already going to try to fight me. So, see, I'm just going to sew nice and slowly. And again, if my needle is down, I can lift my presser foot up and kind of jiggle this fabric around the way I want it. Nice and slow and controlled. Just moving this as I need to. Needle down. I can lift that presser foot if I need to. Move the fabric a little bit. So always just stop with your needle down, and then you can feel more secure when you're like pulling on your fabric that you're not going to actually rip out your work. Okay, again, needle down. Just make sure, and I'm just pulling this around, shifting it as I go, trying to keep on that 1/2 inch or near the fold of that bias tape. And I think I'm almost coming around. And now I'm coming through all that thickness. So just make sure, again, you're not sewing down the fold of the bias tape that you're going to need in a minute. And you can do the same thing as we did before, which is kind of sew over the line where you started, and that way you've kind of locked it in place. Okay, so right now we're going to double check that we've still got all of this fold available to us. So I'm just gonna try to open it all the way around. And it looks like I do. Okay, so here's where, oh, and we're just gonna make sure, see, like I wanna make sure I didn't capture any folds of fabric. That looks like it's trying to pull a little bit, but I think if I press that, see, it's like just these subtle little folds, which will make it not look pretty. I can kind of work the tension of that out. Okay, so now what we'll do is it looks kind of like this, right? You've got this little piece sewn. So what I want to do is open this up, and very similar to like when we sew a hem, I want to take all the seam allowance, press it up there, fold this part over, right? So now I've sandwiched it all the seam allowance inside. I guess this is more similar to when we did like a waistband, right? Sandwich it all in there, and then I will fold this under one more time all the way around so that my finished edge actually looks like this. I don't want to see the binding. That's not what I was going for. That's another thing you can do, but that's not what we were going for here. We weren't going for like a binding that we see, like a decorative binding. We're using it as a finishing edge. So the edge ends up looking like this from the outside. I don't see anything. And then right on the inside, I would see the binding, and I'm gonna hand slip stitch this in place, okay? So what I can do, I can iron this to get it all down. I can pin it here where I've got all this excess, right? I can just take that extra and let it fold up together as one. But the idea is that I'm going to take all this seam allowance and put it into the fold, and then fold it over, right? To get it all folded towards the inside. So it looks like that. So this is definitely, I'm gonna have to start pinning, right? And then again, what you could do is you could technically machine sew this and try to catch through all the layers here, but it usually pulls quite a bit, like here, right? Pulls and leaves, it's pretty ugly. So I say a hand slip stitch is what I actually want you to do. It's going to be so much better. You're definitely going to have better control. So I want you to do it. Okay. And this is one of those things too. It's like it's such a tiny area to pin, so maybe go long ways if you need to. Whatever you have to do to get it pinned down and in the right place. Definitely have to finesse it. And what we want to see, so this is the inside, is this. We want to see just that baby edge of the outside of the fabric on the inside. What that means and ensures is that when I'm on the outside, I don't see any of the binding, which again, I don't want to see. That belongs on the inside only. So if I make sure that when I'm pinning it and getting it set in place, that I see that tiny, tiny edge from this inside, then I know it's going to be good. If you've got too much here and it's like fighting you and you're not able to fold this, you can trim this now. You just like we did like with a French seam or something. You could trim this down and get it really nice and tiny so that there's less bulk for you to try to fold under. At this point, as long as you've caught it, you're good. Oops. And we're gonna go all the way around. Just really nice and easy. And again, you'll hand slip stitch this. If it's easier for you to work with, and we've been doing it so much, and it is like just always a great way to do things, you can hand baste it just like real quickly, just where you've got the pins before you do your hand slip stitch, so that the pins aren't messing with you and being annoying. Even folding this now is like, there we go. It's just a matter of patience, which I often don't have either. I just want it to magically get done. But there we go. You can start to see how it's coming, and some parts will start to become easy. And then just make sure again that it looks nice and smooth from the outside. You're taking you know, a small round piece and turning it under, so it's going to want to try to not lay flat and pucker on you, which is also why I think the slip stitch by hand is where you're going to be able to control that doesn't happen too much, because from the outside all you should see are those little tiny picks from your slip stitch. And this is why I say, as you know, you can see, look how much it's kind of like trying to have an excess on this side. If you were to do a machine stitch on this, you would really run into issues with it like wanting to fold. It wouldn't work. But doing a hand slip stitch, you can just catch it every so often where you need to and make it really nice and pretty. Okay, I'm just going to move this one pin that I had on the other side just for continuity. Have them all going in the same direction. And now you can kind of see the entire binding is turned towards the inside. Here is my outside edge, looks really nice, and see there inside is my inside, okay? And you're gonna slip stitch this just as we have been. I've got a double thread knotted. Sorry, I'm not sure what's on my, I just picked this up and there's like chalk on it or something. Ignore that. But I'm going to go ahead and show you how I would start my slip stitch. Again, I would probably start here in this crazy nonsense of the double, but maybe I'll go a little bit further up. And here's my threads from before. You could clip those after, or clip them now. Okay, so I am going to put my knot probably kind of behind the bias binding tape, right? So right now I've only gone through the bias binding tape and kind of placed a knot behind there. And I'll go ahead right now and come straight over and get my 1 or 2 picks in the bodice fabric, okay? So now I've connected these two. And now I'm gonna go right back in and slide my needle into the fold of that bias binding, okay? About 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, something like that, maybe 1/2 inch, how about that? And then we'll come right down, get 1 or 2 picks of the bodice fabric, and then I'll come right back up and do it again. So sliding my needle into the fold of the bias binding, and then pick the bodice, connecting the two, and then come right back up into the fold. Okay, so this is a fairly hidden stitch. This is again, that's my thread from before. All I should see are these little areas where it's connected, and on the outside all I see are these little tiny picks. And again, imagine if I did this in a matching color, you wouldn't see it at all. And what I'm doing, and I'm making sure that my fabric is laying flat and I'm not sewing in any little wrinkles or folds. I'm letting the round shape of the armhole be what it wants to be. I'm holding it in a round shape, you know, like don't hold it flat. You've got to sometimes hold it literally in the round shape. Hopefully when you're touching it in your hands, you'll feel what I mean by that. But let the fabric sometimes be the shape that it wants to be. Don't try to fight it and flatten it sometimes. Sometimes you do fight it and tell it what you want it to do. It's a little mix of both. But so I will just go all the way around. I might just do a little bit of this to kind of show you. And just to show you how this is starting to look, let me pull my pins out here where I've already sewn. And then I can show you, oops, from the outside what it looks like. So you kind of start to see this this little binding kind of line that it makes. And it does, like I say, it kind of tries to gather a little bit, but again, since I'm not fighting the fabric, I'm trying to let it lay as it lays. Hopefully when I finish this, and I set it out on the mannequin, this is still kind of under the armpit, it'll look nice, and it'll look kind of flat, and I'll iron it if I need to, and maybe shoot it with some steam to let some of these wrinkles kind of fall out. But I will just keep going all the way around and finish off this slip stitch, making it as neat and nice as I can. And then ultimately you will have a bodice that has one sleeve totally finished, set in sleeve, and also hemmed at the bottom, and you will have one sleeveless side. And this way, when you go to make your dress for your final dress, you will have options. You can do either a sleeved dress or a sleeveless dress. And whatever option you choose, you're going to repeat the technique that we are doing right now. So you'll either do the sleeve just as we did it, or you'll do the sleeveless just as we did it. And if you do a sleeve, you can shorten it. If you want to make a short sleeve instead of a long sleeve, that's fine. But if you do the sleeveless, you'll do it just like this. There we go. Let me see. Just got a little bit more to see how that's looking from the outside. Like that. See, there's just these little picks from the outside. And I don't see any of the binding. And it just curls over really nicely to the inside. So it's a nice, finished, pretty seam. Okay?